Well, to segue us into that part of the conversation today, I'd like to just make an observation, which is my experience in being in and around knowledge management and knowledge managers, so to speak, is that there's a common thread that I see among many people in the field, and that is that they have had a wide range of experiences and interests that and some depth in each of those areas, which when you bring them together creates a very unique set of skills. And people who have that kind of, and dare I say a word, personality, that are intrigued by uncertainty and they're not afraid of, not quite knowing exactly what's going to happen in their job tomorrow. If they are a little bit adventurous, these are the people who really seem to put things together, like you're describing, all these different experiences, starting with psychology, talking about then, working in that area, like the family action systems, and talking about then going to, KPMG and PricewaterhouseCooper, and then oh man, what a history you have of all these different experiences, and then competitive intelligence, starting your own company, which is now 27 years old. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And all of that together, you know, if I didn't know you, I would go, well, what the heck does that have to do with value? But I know you, and I know that this has all come together, as you were just starting to say, to really kind of congeal a perspective on value that's really, really important for us to understand in the kind of work that we do, for the reasons that you just stated about if you don't know how to sell it or you don't know what it's worth. So with that, I just wanted to say that you have always struck me as having a great range of capabilities and skill sets that you've brought together in a really coherent way. I have your book, and John Ryan was your copy editor for De Gruyter, so
Yes.
he's my copy editor for Libri. So we have that common
Good
connection as
man.
well. Yeah,
Yes.
he's a good man.
Yeah.
So anyway, so I think this would be a good segue now that everybody has a pretty good idea of the, the jack of all trades, so to speak, approach that's led you to this place. But what's really important to me that I think is worth sharing with the class is that you have these skill sets that aren't just lightly, they're not a light touch of these skill sets. You've got really solid, deep roots in all of these things that have brought you to be able to talk in a very articulate, educated, smart way about value and valuation. And that's why I wanted you to come talk. So with that, take it away and let's hear what you
Well,
thoughts are.
thank you for all your kind words. It actually comes to a more visceral level impact as well, because when you go through well, first of all, let me say, as a consultant, when I joined KPMG, it was kind of a mysterious kind of world to me, because some of my colleagues from Yale School of Management, went into nonprofits, and some of them went into government, but most of them went to the private sector. And the attractive industry then, tech didn't really exist as an industry. The two attractive industries, which are still two of the three attractive industries to MBAs, are consulting and banking.
Mhm.
And the reason why they're interesting is, I think, to highly curious people, is because they're kind of in the business. You learn about businesses, and you see businesses in different ways, and you sort of thinking about what are the general principles that we can extract about business. Um, but when you're a consultant, you sort of see firsthand, and I saw at KPMG, not to single them out, but they're a very well-run company. But in those days, you could see the frustrations of what we were dealing with. We didn't have the internet. We didn't really, it was a global firm or global brand name, and we were representing ourselves as a global firm, but we weren't really. We were a bunch of smart people with good credentials individually, but the connections that we could make as a firm were really, there was your small team, and that was pretty much it. I mean, occasionally we would try to reach out and find out, has anybody done this project before? and stuff like that. And you'd find out just sort of accidentally, oh yeah, well, Joe Blow, 5 years ago did something like this. Let's see if we can find the work papers. It was a very exhausting and not very rewarding process. When I got to then later on, when I got to PwC, I was involved with a guy named Andy Zimmerman who had a project called Reach, I believe it was called. It was building an internal knowledge network to make that kind of stuff easier. And I worked a little bit with Andy on that, and it was the beginnings of trying to do that. Um, One of those firms, or after I started my own company, called me. Actually, both I became consultants to both my former employers, and one of them, without singling them out, brought me back to diagnose a knowledge system that they thought was not working very well. And I went in and started what I still do now, which is asking a bunch of questions of the what I call the supply siders, which is the knowledge managers and the knowledge producers, and the demand side, which is the knowledge clients.
Mhm.
And that's how I operate. I see knowledge as an economic transaction. There's a producer and there's a user. Uh, and so, anyway, to make a long story short, what I found out in that case, and it's been my observation in many other cases since then, is that there was a mismatch between those two sides. The producers weren't producing what the users needed, and the users, it turned out in that particular case, weren't really consulted up front. It was one of these IT driven systems that the IT people were very happy with how wonderful it was. The users never used it, and you get into a doom loop where if people don't use it, word of mouth travels pretty quickly, as you know, with any product. If it's not very good, it gets just in a doom loop of people not using it and then not putting in, because the users were expected to also put in information into the system.
Right.
Uh, so I became I called myself Dr. No for a while with a K. It was fixing these systems. And I became, in some cases, and I still remain, as I mentioned in our pre warm up, I remain proudly an outsider from the field of knowledge and IT in particular. Some of my best friends are IT and what I would call hard knowledge people, and I am not. And but I'm actively engaged in conversations on SIKM and stuff like that with people that are systems people. But I constantly challenge them. And one of the other experiences I forgot to mention at Find, I sort of created this group doing voice of the customer research, and I became with an insurance company. I developed this process for finding out more in depth about what their clients were interested in, and that really has served me well and never left me. I consider myself now a demand side expert for knowledge. I will be the one, because of my familiarity with business in general, to go in and talk to the clients of customers, of knowledge people, and say what's working, what's not working, and what do you need more and what do you need less of. And what I found over time is, that there's my thing called the knowledge value chain, which is basically took the data information knowledge model that was kind of around, and then I grafted on top of that what I learned in business school, which is about decision making, decisions, actions, and values. I mean, one of the things I found out again and again is in large organizations, complex organizations, the demand side and the producer side are different, and they don't really even talk to each other. So when I was an MBA and studied the Harvard case method, um, you're basically given a stack of knowledge, so to speak, of information that you have to digest and play back as a solution, a 30-page stack of. But you sort of handed this bunch of information, and that's just kind of what you work from. And so the training, I think, that MBAs in those days are given, and probably still, about the information process, the development process, is basically that it just shows up magically in your case book and you have to study it. They have no awareness of what people who produce knowledge go through. And I think the reverse is true. To complete the pictures, the people that produce knowledge, and I've taught at people at two major universities, as I mentioned, done a lot of informal lecturing here, don't really understand the people they're producing knowledge for, or the context in which they're producing it, the economic context, the competitive context in which they're producing it. And sometimes they don't even, frankly, I think, want to know. They just want to do their thing and do their thing well, and everything will take care of itself. Well, during the recession of, as I mentioned, 2000 and the recession of 2008, I found that wasn't true. And knowledge groups were cut right, left, and center because people in tough times. I mean, during fat times, companies say, yeah, let's try this, let's try that, let's do this and that and the other thing, very fancy stuff. And then when tough times come, they say, okay, well, we've got to cut something. What are we going to cut? What's this knowledge stuff? What is that adding to our bottom line? Or how do we use that? No, well, okay, let's cut that. It's just too easy to cut. It was too easy to cut in 2000. It's too easy to cut in 2008. And I think it remains in some cases too easy to cut. So I basically said to myself, Tim, you're a former psychologist and you understand this knowledge stuff. You've got an MBA now. Is there anything you can do to save the professions, to save the careers, literally, of your colleagues in this field? And I said, well, I should write this book. I should write down everything I can think of that I learned in MBA school in this book. And so it's my tagline for the book at one point was, what if knowledge got an MBA? Like, what if you could think like an MBA thinks about knowledge? That's the simple premise for the book and for really my whole work. So when, and I did, as I mentioned, spend 10 years hanging around accountants in the big four firms. So I understand those were my clients, especially at PwC. So I understand how they think in a lot of cases, and how accountants think. Well, a couple things is, one is they're very literal minded. When they call them bean counters, somewhat pejoratively, it's not too far off the mark. They're very good at counting tangible assets. And I briefly probably the most boring part for most people in my book is the part on accounting treatments, but it's the most interesting part to me because I know that everything really hinges on that. And you can go in a nutshell. Let me give you an illustration. Well, the principle is that knowledge doesn't appear on a balance sheet. It does not appear in corporate financial statements. And people that are trained in classical financial stuff, like people that have MBAs and people that have CPAs and CFAs, all the people that have classical financial training don't think they're really real. I mean, it's hilarious. I just did a test the other day. I took a company just at random, the company Altria that makes Marlboro cigarettes, which is 1 out of every 2 cigarettes sold in the United States. Cigarettes is still a viable market. It's a big market, big, huge market. And this company has the Marlboro brand, which is one of the most valuable brands is in terms of brand equity. And I remember the first time I heard that term, brand equity. I thought, this is so valuable. This trademark Marlboro, this little red thing, it's money in the bank. And yet, and if you look at the financial statements, I just did this the other day with Altria, the term brand is mentioned about 75 times in their annual report. It's extremely important. It's the most, well, I didn't test this. It was probably the single most mentioned word, other than the or a. It's very important. However, when you look at the financial statements, it doesn't appear. It doesn't appear anywhere. So a strict financial interpretation, which is what the accounting firms produce, does not include knowledge. It doesn't really include intangible assets, except in there's certain rarefied conditions where they're purchased from outside the company. So I think the mentality comes down with people. Many people who run companies have financial backgrounds. Some of them are CPAs themselves, and the mentality subtly comes down through, if I can't see it, if I can't measure it, it's not real. And the old saw we all know, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So and knowledge management, I think, finds itself still in a position where you can't, not only can't you measure it, but in some cases you can't really define it accurately. I'm constantly monitoring these conversations about what does knowledge management mean to you. I was on a conversation at 8 o'clock last night and somebody gave a definition, a world expert on knowledge management. And when he said it, I didn't want to debate him there. It wasn't appropriate, but it was completely not the answer I would have given. And, you know, if you ask a dozen knowledge management experts what to define it, you get 2 dozen answers as far as what it is. There's no coherent definition. So knowledge managers who come into companies and say, we're here to manage knowledge, if they're talking to the chairman of the board or the CEO and say, we're here to help you manage something that we can't really define and we can't measure it, you know, it's tough. It's tough. It's like not really it's not a good proposition, a strong
Hard
proposition.
sell.
How are you going to sell this stuff? Well, how you're going to sell it, I think, starts with making things tangible. A lot of what I do in the book is have diagrams. There are 40 diagrams in the book, and I'm always, if you see me lecture, my slides are mostly pictures because I think that's what works for the intangible, which knowledge is, you know, which is maybe 44% of enterprise value nowadays, but it's not on the balance sheet, and most people don't really understand what it is that we're talking about. I think we're partly talking about what's in people's heads, and I probably have changed my view on this. I think, you know, Peter Drucker said it's what's in people's heads, and I think I probably repeated that in my book, but I think it's more than that now. I think there are other sort of organizational aspects. Knowledge is social, and there are things like networks, communities. There are things in an organization like processes, procedures, policies. There are all kinds of other intangible assets that you might consider knowledge. Again, depending on your definition. I have a big tent definition. It's not just what's in people's heads, and it's certainly not what's in documents. But there are other things. Um, IP I consider part of it, a key part of it. Copyrights, trademarks, patents, trade secrets, that kind of thing. Brand equity, I think, as I mentioned, is terribly important. And I consider that part of the sort of quasi knowledge. It's an intangible asset. So the valuation, the question becomes, how do you do valuation? And the approach to valuation, that the accountants basically, when they put stuff down on the balance sheets, they're basically saying, here, the way most things are valued is, here's the cost of what we paid for it minus the depreciation. If you're talking about a plant or a piece of equipment, here's what we paid for it. Here's how many years we're depreciating at an X% rate. So here's what it's worth now. And what it really means is, what's the value that we could sell it for? If the company, let's say, you know, unlikely to happen, but let's say we had a bankruptcy and we had to get rid of our assets, what could we sell them for? What would shareholders get? That's kind of the hidden message. It's all for shareholders.
Mhm.
But when and IP, if a patent or piece of intellectual property is developed outside and then bought, then that's accounted for that way. But if not, if it's developed, all the knowledge that's developed internally is not accounted for that way. Some of which has great value. My colleague J.C. Spender, he said, you know, all the stuff that companies value on their balance in their financial books, property and equipment, for example, would have no value if people didn't know how to use them. If the workers did not how to use these, without knowledge, those assets would be completely worthless.
Mhm.
And I remember a story years ago. There was a story in the 80s, I think this was, that there was a new generation of machine tools coming out from Germany that were very complex to run. And the Germans had figured out that there were certain countries they couldn't ship these to because, and one of those was the United States. The United States was pointed out as having the workers, to put it bluntly, were too dumb to run these machines. They didn't have the intellectual capability or the training to run the good machines. So they had to send them the previous generation, the not so smart machines, because the workers couldn't run them. We would see that, I think, as a learning and development, or whatever you want to call it. Again, there are even some disciplines within organizations that sort of flirt with each other, but you know, KM's here and learning and development, I'm finding it as different. IT's over here. Human capital is a very interesting area that I don't really know much about. I started to learn through the conference board, but that's a whole other area about, and there's some interesting stuff going on there about some companies are moving, and Deloitte, I know, is pushing this idea, which is called the skills-based company. Instead of valuing uh, instead of valuing employees based on their degrees and academic credentials, why not value them based on their skills that they've acquired? As you know, there's a lot of credentialing going on outside universities. No disrespect intended to universities. They remain the core of our credentialing, but there are a lot of other. You'll see on LinkedIn. I see some of my students from Columbia have the Columbia degree, MSc, and then they have these other designations like PMP, for example, and they're very meaningful, rigorous, I think, designations of
Mhm.
specialties, project
Right.
management, and these other areas. I mean, this competitive intelligence people have talked about credentialing in that field. The KM people are talking about credentialing outside the university system, credentialing of knowledge management and that kind of thing. So companies are seeing this as a valid way to more at the skill level rather than the employee level, almost the skill level, and sort of this almost becoming this knowledge market internally within companies. Kind of an exciting idea to find the right skill for the project. And companies are now run, a lot on projects, on temporary projects. Is less important. When I studied management, it was about tables of organization, all this stuff that's kind of hierarchical, and that doesn't work anymore. The kind of management we have now is more peer to peer and network based and stuff like that. It's a whole different management framework. So to answer your question at long last, and I digress a lot, and thank you for allowing me to do that. But the evaluation that I do is to come in and make stuff more valuable. I can't say necessarily that I have a hard metric that I'm going to measure, nor do I think it's recommended um, to do this. But I'm not going to come in and give you a value, a number. I mean, if I were paid to do that, I could probably do it. But the criterion of value that I use is, are users using this information? I'll never forget when I was at Find SVP, one of my clients was a major New York bank, and he said, Tim, our company buys all this information. We buy from you, we buy from everybody, buy all this information, and we don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
And I said, what? Can you say that again, please? And that became one of these lightning bolts to me. We don't do anything with it. And I thought to myself, it's nice to say we spent all this money and all this information, but if you didn't do anything with it, the value was nothing. The realized value, it was basically an expense. You can just write that off and say that was an expense, goodbye. The only way there's an ROI, return on investment, means there's an expense, but there's uh, money coming back in from something that's there's a benefit, there's a cost, and there's a benefit.
Mhm.
So if there's no benefit realized, and I believe the benefits are only realized in using information, and I believe I'm really old school, I know, on this, but excuse me, it's to make decisions. Decision making is my training, and that's the way my clients work. And I think human decision making and user decision making is at the core of user value. The values at the core of the benefits are at the core of the value proposition. At the core of benefits are users, and at the core of users is how they use information to make decisions. And I mean, people at companies, the higher level people you deal with in companies, and I've dealt with some pretty high level people, you can see their job is really allocating resources. People who run large organizations, they basically have this whole bunch of people working for them and a bunch of other resources, and their job is to sort of be a conductor, like to orchestrate these resources and say, more violins, less timpani, more of this, more of that. And I mean, I really think as knowledge, I've talked about this too, knowledge leadership is orchestrating those resources on behalf of clients. Clients' needs are constantly shifting, and that's another opportunity I think for knowledge is to. And I have a thing called knowledge dynamics that I just introduced at KM World last year, zombie knowledge and that kind of thing. How does knowledge shift to with the shifting nature of the organizations? And one thing I've been glad to come on in the conference board is they monitor CEO sentiments globally every year. They come out with a new survey every single year of CEOs across the world. And it's a very dynamic list. The list of things that companies care about, as defined by their CEO, and the CEO, if the CEO cares, it tends to be the rest of the organization cares. Those shift constantly. Things will move up and down the chain. So, how does knowledge shift with those? And knowledge dynamics is what I've created as come upon as a description for that. I think that often that's neglected as far as knowledge management goes, and knowledge management tends to be more static in my.
Mhm.
So what I'll do, I'll come into a company and say, you guys could do something better. I mean, I have one example recently. I went into a company, and a lot of their work at the bottom of the knowledge value chain was sourcing data, really sourcing information. And the clients were saying to me, well, excuse me, we can do that ourselves, a lot of that. But instead of getting rid of the knowledge group, we want to, and what I managed to help them do is I moved them up the value chain. I said, they don't need you to do that stuff anymore. They can do a lot of the basic bottom level stuff themselves. What they need is analysis and interpretation and curation. There's so much information out there that one of the things they need to do is be made aware of what the good information is versus the less quality information, sort of curation, stuff like that. So I positioned them up the chain, and 6 months later, I did a follow up, and they were ecstatic. Their jobs were much more interesting. It was a win-win. The clients liked it better, and they liked better what they were doing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's really employing or applying the data to make it intelligence rather than just data or information, as we
Yeah,
say in the library world. Yeah,
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 yeah. So my definition is a sort of relative value. I'll increase the value without necessarily having the baseline metric. I increase the value in user value as interpreted by the users.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's good. That's really good. So I'd like to move us to the third segment of our interview with you today, and just sort of ask you to summarize for the students maybe a couple of key takeaways that would be important for them to remember, besides the fact that I will say to them, buy Tim's book because he knows what he's talking about. It's a very helpful book, and it really has all those graphics and tables and figures and charts and stuff are all really helpful. So it's, to me, it's the best thing that I've seen about valuation in KM that I can think of. So I think it's a useful tool to have if you're going to end up doing any kind of work where you have to sell your KM stuff and you have to know the value of it and be able to talk about it. That's a really good resource for them. So what would be some key takeaways that you might have for them?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will say that one of the things I'm trying to do, the book is expensive. It's not even available in some all the time, but I'm trying to boil down these things into videos. I have a couple of videos on YouTube produced already, and that's part of what I'm trying to do is bring it to the rest of the world. I do think they're important ideas and could be valuable. Um, I would say the key thing is uh, is to think of knowledge in an economic context. Always think of the producer and the user, the supply side, the demand side. That's the key foundation for my thinking about everything, really. Um, so the user, the producer and the user, the producers often don't think of the users, and vice versa. So the producers may have to educate the users as far as the production process. But keep the user and the demand side front and center. And if you don't know about that, find out about it, or hire me or other people to find out for you. But that's really critical. Um, the second principle I'd say is okay. Users are at the center of the value universe. Value is a very simple formulas in the book, but they're based on two very simple principles. One is cost, and one is benefit. And understanding what those are is simple. Seems simple at first. Cost and benefit, cost benefit analysis. Benefit divided by cost, V equals B over C. That seems simple, and it is at the beginning. Um, it gets a little more complicated when you think that they're unmeasurable but real benefits. If you see that, if you understand that everything real is not necessarily measurable, that opens up a world of opportunity and complexity at the same time. Um, and so the first principle is user centric. Second principle is value. The third principle, I think, is dynamics. Things are changing. The what worked last year may not work in the future, and we kind of have to kind of constantly be on this. This is actually part of the ISO spec for knowledge management. There's a 4-step knowledge management spec for roles in knowledge management, determining knowledge, finding it, making it available, or two and three. And then the fourth is refreshing knowledge based on changing conditions. And that's one thing I think many knowledge managers are not trained in, and they don't see that as their job. But I'd say knowledge dynamics is the third point. And the fourth point, probably, if I had to name the top four, would be connectedness. That the knowledge is social. It's contained in a social context. It's it's political. Quite frankly, knowledge is political. I wrote a thesis while an undergraduate based on Michel Foucault's work, but knowledge is power is a very outdated way of looking at it. But knowledge is social, and power in organizations. To me, knowledge and power in organizations are two separate things, and they need to be reconciled. So understanding the even the politics of your organization, who is who, and who's your friend, who's your champion, who's your skeptic, the financial people that say this stuff is meaningless, understanding that kind of stuff in context, I think will save your job in some cases, and make it more productive and interesting. I think knowledge people should be much highly much more highly valued than they are, and could be, but they partly have to shoulder some of the responsibility for that too. Nobody's going to say, hey, you're so valuable, you should be running this company or whatever. They have to kind of earn it, and I think they have to earn it by mastering some of these concepts that they're simple. Finance and stuff like that are easy. I mean, I studied it for 2 years. I'm pretty smart, but I mean, it's complicated, and it can seem more complicated than it is, but at some level, and I tried to do this in all my work, is to make it simple, but having some understanding, at least some understanding, that you understand what you know and what you don't know. The proverbial, you know, don't have unknown unknowns. That might even be a fifth principle. Try to eliminate the unknown unknowns. If something's a known unknown, then you can research it and find out about it. If it's an unknown unknown, it's like an iceberg underwater. Your ship is gonna run into. It's the iceberg is going to look like it's out there, and boom, you hit it, because it was really an iceberg. It was right up here, So know what you don't know, I guess, is always a good principle for every situation.
It's great. Thank
Yeah.
you for that. That's going to be really helpful. I'm learning a lot from this.
You're too kind. Well, the feeling is mutual, Kendra. Your questions are great.
Well, I have one last question for you, and that is just, do you have any last words or advice for the students?
Um, read the newspaper. That's always how I used to teach on Saturdays when I taught at LIU. I'd buy a bunch of Wall Street journals, 15 or 20 copies, and hand them out to people. And I'd say, just pick an article, at random, and I'd say, what's going on. I know a lot of my students hate to hear this, but I will tell them the best information I get about anything practically is from the Wall Street Journal. Whether or not I agree editorially with them, I'll leave up to you. But let me say, I don't typically, but the information they have about the business and organizational world is unparalleled. And if you just read the newspaper, you will find a great bunch of information. I mean, knowledge is always in the newspapers. This week it's in there twice, because I mean, recently we had document discovery gate, or whatever you want to call it, classified documents, a knowledge information management problem in spades, all over the newspaper every day, front and center. And now we have this awareness gap. I heard a new term this morning, domain awareness gap. I thought that sounds interesting, about why we didn't know about this Chinese balloon. That domain, there
Yeah,
was a domain awareness gap.
yeah.
Um,
That's a nice way of
so
saying somebody messed up.
so I say read the newspaper, and just maybe once a week at least, and see how does this, and I'm guarantee you'll find at least one or sometimes several articles that directly relate to your field. What really turns me on is the impact that information is having on our society, and is going to have on our society, and legislators and governments are sort of all just trying to catch up with, chat GPT and all, they're way trying to catch up. But leaders in the field, I believe, will be the people that you teach, that you will help, bring along. Is these will be the knowledge leaders. Knowledge leadership is a term I use all the time. Guy St. Clair sort of, and I kind of, maybe he asked me to speak on it, or I asked to speak on it, but we kind of, knowledge leadership, knowledge strategy, be ahead of these issues and be ahead of how your organization is using knowledge. And they'll love you. They'll bring you into the corner office and say, we need your expert advice on this. And there's no reason why knowledge people shouldn't be, again, should be chief knowledge officer. I think was a thing of the past, and I think it's a thing of the future. Right now, maybe we're in a period where it doesn't exist, but I think it'll come back, or the need for it, maybe in a different brand form, will come back. It's too important.
I think that's a really, really excellent point. And we do have a course that's required for our students called Thought Leadership and Knowledge Management. So
Super.
that's one of the main purposes of that class, is to help them understand the value, if you will, of what they're going to be bringing to whatever organization they work for, and what goes along with that in terms of just the leadership aspects of being a knowledge manager. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I support exactly what you said about reading the newspapers. When I was first out of my master's program, my first job was as a business information center manager for a publishing company. And I worked with the publishers who had sat around dreaming up new ideas for publications all the time. And so I was responsible for doing secondary market research and helping them get the backgrounds that they needed to go to their single sponsored advertiser supported journal, or rather magazine, and get all the demographics of their patients or whoever they were. So we had a dental health advisor, for example, was a publication, and I had to get information on how many, what were the demographics of their patients, and how many were there in the top 100 SMSAs back in that day. Well, in addition to that, because the nature of the topics was so broad and so varied, it was impossible to be an expert in any one field. So what I would do every day when the mail came in, which happened to be first thing in the morning, I would go through my Fortune, Forbes, New York Times, Wall Street Journal with my coffee, and just turn page by page and skim. And I would skim all of those. It probably took me, maybe an hour. And that was the first thing I did every day. And in those days, we didn't have much in the way of computing. This was a long time ago. But I would take those charts in USA Today that were in the bottom left-hand corner of each section of the paper, and
Yeah.
out and index them and cut and paste them into a notebook I had. And that actually turned out to be one of the best resources I ever had. So I had a question, for example, on baseball statistics historically, and I had one of those charts in there that covered that from USA Today. So that's exactly right. The benefit of doing that, regardless of what job you're in, is to understand the context of business in the country, in the world, to know how your organization fits in. And it keeps you abreast of those trends, those icebergs, those unknown unknowns, as you say. And that's a really good thing to have, just a sense of what's going on. And furthermore, I believe that studies have shown that CEOs do some of this as well. They read these papers, they go through, they skim them, they get most of their information from each other, but they also read a lot. So if you've got some sense of what's happening, that will just increase your value so that you can be articulate about what's happening in the world at any given moment.
Absolutely.
I support what you said exactly. And with that, I just want to thank you again for being with us today. This has been a really interesting topic, and one that's so very important. And I'm sure the students got a lot out of it, and they're going to be writing about it in their journals or talking about it in their podcasts.
Well, I wish them all luck. And regarding the book, if or any of my other work, and there's a lot of stuff on my blog, if anybody has any questions who's listening, just feel free to reach out to me. I love talking about my work and be happy to answer questions. Dr. Albright, thank you so much. I can't believe it took us all this time to finally cross paths. We came so close,
I know.
to
So much.
meeting, but I really appreciate it. I think your program just sounds great. I mean, I wish I were young enough to come back and go into it again. It just sounds perfect. It sounds delicious. And I wish
Oh, thank
you and all your students the best of luck. And thank you for having me.
thank you so much.
Great conversation.